Imagine you're walking through a house where every door creaks like a coffin lid. You enter a room, and the air is heavy with the scent of moth-eaten lace and old candle wax. Along the walls, mannequins stand dressed in bridal gowns, 39 of them. Each one perfectly arranged, untouched by dust, waiting for a ceremony that never came. But the strangest part, the woman who owned them was called the widow, and she had never been married once. Why did she keep them? Who were they for? And why did so many men who courted her vanish without a trace? This story was not meant to be told, because if you look too closely, you begin to wonder, were these dresses trophies of love or of death? The first time she was spoken of as the widow, it was not in reverence, nor even in sympathy. It was whispered, almost spat, from the lips of the women in town who tightened their shawls and turned their eyes away as she walked past. To be a widow without ever having married was, in their minds, a sign of something unnatural, something bent against the will of both God and society. Clara Haraway carried herself with a quiet dignity, but the silence that surrounded her was heavy, and that silence was where the rumors began to feed. People asked why she never married, though her features had once drawn suitors. They asked why, though she had been courted, she had never been seen on the arm of any man for long. She was called the widow, not out of pity, but because no other title seemed to fit. Her black veils, her refusal to wear color, her habit of mourning for something unnamed, it all gave the impression of a woman who had been left behind by death. Ashford Hollow was not a forgiving place for women who strayed outside expectation. In the 1870s, a woman without a husband was a woman without protection, without station, and often without identity. But Clara seemed to embrace that role, carving out her own identity through absence rather than presence. She lived alone in a farmhouse on the edge of town, the shutters always half drawn, a single candle often burning in the upstairs window long after midnight. Travelers would glance up from the road and swear they saw her silhouette framed in the glass, standing motionless as though watching for someone who never arrived. To the farmers who worked the land nearby, she was a figure of unease, unmoving, patient and unyielding in her solitude. Her name carried a weight that made conversations pause. Clara Haraway, the widow of Ashford Hollow. To speak it aloud was to summon both pity and dread, and yet behind the locked doors of her house, she was not merely the figure of mourning she presented to the world. She was a collector, and her chosen relics were wedding dresses. Each dress was kept with meticulous care, folded and hung, guarded against decay. 39 of them, lined up like pale ghosts in rooms no one else ever entered. The fact alone might have seemed like eccentricity, a hobby born of loneliness. But in Clara's case, the collection was a riddle, and riddles invite suspicion. The neighbors began to count the suitors who had courted her and failed to return. It was not as though they all vanished suddenly, but in the manner of small towns. Each absence was catalogued, whispered, woven into the tapestry of rumor that clothed her life. A blacksmith's apprentice who once walked her to Sunday service was later said to have left for the mines, but never sent word home. A traveling merchant who shared stories with her by the well was never again seen on the roads. A school teacher who had written her poems packed his belongings one evening and simply did not open his schoolhouse the next morning. No one could say with certainty what became of these men, but the timing was always noted. First the promise of affection, then the silence, then another dress hanging in her upstairs room. The town was divided between those who believed she was cursed and those who believed she was the curse itself. To be cursed was almost forgivable, pitiable, a woman marked by misfortune. But to be the curse was another matter, a living omen of ruin. Mothers warned their sons not to wander too close, though more than one ignored the warnings and tried his luck. Clara was beautiful in a way that unnerved, her pale face framed in black lace, her eyes heavy with something unsaid. She carried with her the strange allure of danger, and danger in those days often disguised itself as love. People began to describe her presence in strange ways. Some said she seemed to be waiting for a wedding that had been promised long ago, rehearsing it endlessly with her collection. Others said she walked the graveyard paths as if escorting unseen brides to their burials. More than one child swore. They saw her speaking to the mannequins that stood in her upstairs rooms, fitted in their gowns, their faces hidden beneath veils. Of course, children tell tales, but adults too began to speak of the way the candlelight flickered strangely in her house, the way no birds perched on her roof, the way even stray dogs gave her property a wide berth. Clara's dresses became symbols, even among those who had never seen them. When young wives gathered, they whispered about them as though each was stitched with a story of betrayal or loss. They speculated that Clara had purchased them from grieving widows, hoarding the remnants of other women's happiness. Others insisted they had belonged to brides who never walked down the aisle, their fiancés lost to war, illness, or worse. But the darker theory, the one that gripped the imagination, was that the dresses had once been intended for Clara herself. That each time a suitor courted her, she prepared a gown. That each time the man disappeared, and that she kept the gowns as proof of her devotion, or perhaps as trophies of her loss. Her solitude became ritualized. On Sundays, she appeared at church, but never joined the congregation's conversations afterward. She lit candles not only in her home, but also in the cemetery, standing before graves that were not hers to mourn. She was seen walking the road at dusk, trailing her fingers along the fences, humming softly to herself. In the marketplace, she rarely spoke, only nodded, always in black, always carrying herself like a woman in permanent mourning. These gestures, simple in themselves, accumulated into something heavier, a portrait of a woman living in the shadow of something unspeakable. No one ever entered her home during her lifetime. Invitations were not given, and even if they had been, few would have dared accept. Her world existed behind closed doors, her secrets guarded as fiercely as any locked chest. And yet the idea of what was inside became a kind of public obsession. Whispers grew into legends. Travelers passing through were told stories of the widow with her room of dresses, each one linked to a man who had vanished. Some laughed it off as superstition, others left town with unease etched into their faces. For the people of Ashford Hollow, however, the legend was part of their daily life, a presence that hung in the air like the toll of a distant bell. Her identity became inseparable from the mystery she carried. To speak of Clara Haraway was to speak of her dresses, her vanished suitors, her midnight vigils in the graveyard. She was not simply a woman, but a symbol of what frightened people most: the unknown. The dresses were the evidence of a story that no one could fully tell, the silent testimony of a life lived between desire and dread. And so, the name stuck. The widow of Ashford Hollow, the woman who lived as though death had chosen her as its bride, and who stitched that marriage into fabric 39 times over. The collection itself was like nothing anyone could have imagined. 39 gowns, each one a vision of purity and promise, locked away in a house that had never known laughter or music. They were not stacked carelessly in trunks or left to yellow in corners. No, Clara Haraway treated them with the reverence of relics. Each was hung on wooden stands, their skirts spread carefully, their veils arranged as if the bride might return at any moment to step into them. Some were gowns of simple muslin, suited for modest country weddings. Others bore intricate lace, delicate embroidery, imported fabrics that would have cost more than most families in Ashford Hollow could afford. The diversity of the collection made it all the more baffling. Why would a woman who never married, who had no sisters, no daughters, no family to inherit such garments, keep them at all? The first time anyone caught sight of the dresses was by accident. A neighbor claimed she had seen them through a half-open window one autumn evening when the light was just right. She said the gowns looked like ghosts standing in a row, their white forms flickering in the candlelight. Word of this vision spread quickly, and though no one admitted to spying further, the image of those gowns haunted the imagination of the townsfolk. They began to talk of the room in hushed tones, as if it were sacred or cursed. It became known simply as the bridal chamber. Children dared one another to creep close to the house and peer through the cracks, though few ever claimed success. They said the dresses moved, even when the air was still. Some swore they saw shadows flitting between them, shapes that were not Clara's. To grown men and women, these tales sounded like childish exaggerations, but in the silence of their own homes, they admitted the thought unsettled them. The collection was too deliberate, too carefully preserved to be innocent. It felt like preparation, but for what? The gowns themselves told stories if one looked closely. A few carried stains, faint and rust-colored, along the hems or hidden folds. Others had fabric torn in places that suggested violence, not simple wear. On the bodices of some, tiny initials were stitched in thread barely visible unless one leaned close. Who had sewn them there? Were they marks of ownership, tokens of memory, or something more sinister? The discovery of these details came much later, when Clara's life had ended and the house was finally unsealed. But the truth of them only deepened the mystery. Each gown seemed to have a personality of its own, as though Clara had selected them with intention, not randomness. The plain ones hung alongside the extravagant, the modest beside the flamboyant. Some appeared never to have been worn, while others bore the faintest impression of a body that had once inhabited them, creases at the waist, a hint of perfume still trapped in the fabric. If they had indeed belonged to real brides, where were those women now? If they had been purchased second-hand, why keep them in such condition, never repurposed, never sold? The dresses were not merely collected, they were staged. Clara positioned them in rows, like an audience, their veiled faces turned toward a central space in the room. At times, a chair stood there, as though someone had been sitting and speaking to them. This arrangement gave the impression of a ritual, a ceremony rehearsed over and over in silence. To imagine Clara seated in that chair, speaking into the stillness, surrounded by 39 silent brides, was enough to make even the most skeptical neighbor shiver. One particularly chilling detail emerged years later from an old diary kept by a woman who had worked briefly as Clara's laundress. She wrote of being summoned to wash several delicate garments, but had been forbidden to ask questions about them. She described fine lace gowns with strange alterations, pockets sewn into the linings, hidden pouches in the skirts. At the time, she assumed they were meant to carry tokens or charms. Only later did she wonder if something darker had been concealed in those folds. The townsfolk's fascination with the collection grew in proportion to their fear. They speculated endlessly about how Clara had come into possession of so many gowns. Some believed she had purchased them from families struck by tragedy, buying the dresses of brides who had died before their weddings could be held. Others insisted the dresses were spoils taken from women whose grooms had vanished after meeting Clara, their planned weddings abandoned, their dresses quietly acquired. A few whispered that Clara had sewn them herself, not as garments but as vessels, garments never meant to be worn, only to hold the memory of men lost. Visitors to the town often asked why the townspeople had not confronted Clara about the collection. The answer was simple: fear. To challenge her would mean entering the house, stepping into the room where the dresses stood. No one wished to cross that threshold. It was as if the room itself had become a boundary between the world of the living and something else. To step inside was to risk being claimed by whatever force held Clara in its grip. When Clara walked through town, the dresses seemed to follow her, though unseen. People imagined them trailing behind her, 39 phantom brides whispering at her heels. When she paused at the cemetery gates, it was said that she lingered there as if counting spaces, as though matching graves to gowns. Some even believed the dresses were not symbols of marriage at all, but of death, that each one marked a soul she had guided into the grave, a union not of bride and groom, but of flesh and earth. The collection remained untouched during Clara's lifetime. No one outside her home ever laid a hand on the gowns. Their existence was part of the town's folklore, half believed, half dreaded. Yet the whispers never ceased, because 39 gowns meant 39 stories, and no one could reconcile such a number with innocence. Even if Clara had bought them, why 39? Why not stop at 1 or 5 or 10? The sheer scale of the collection suggested something obsessive, something driven by compulsion rather than chance. When Clara finally died, her secret was revealed in full. The townspeople, who had feared her for decades, crossed the threshold. At last, they climbed the stairs, their footsteps echoing in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. And when they opened the door to the chamber, the sight froze them where they stood. The dresses stood in perfect formation, untouched by dust, preserved as though the brides had stepped out only moments before. 39 gowns facing the center, veils cascading, a congregation of silence. It was no exaggeration to say that those who saw it never forgot. They described the air as colder in that room, heavier, as though 39 souls lingered just out of sight. It was then that the darker details were uncovered. The stains, the initials, the hidden pouches in the linings. The collection was not simply beautiful. It was unsettling in its precision, its hints of lives attached to each garment. The discovery confirmed what the townspeople had long suspected. These gowns were not a hobby, not mere fabric. They were evidence. Of what? No one could agree. Some clung to the explanation that Clara had been eccentric, a woman obsessed with marriage she never attained. Others whispered that each gown represented a vanished suitor, a life extinguished, a ceremony never completed. The collection was dismantled eventually, but not before its legend was sealed. Even now, when the story of Clara Haraway is told, the dresses are what people remember. 39 gowns, perfectly preserved, each carrying its own secret. The widow of Ashford Hollow lived alone, but her house was never truly empty. It was filled with brides who never wed, and their silent presence remains one of the most haunting mysteries the town ever carried. The year in which her story unfolded was more than a backdrop. It was a force that shaped her very legend. The early 1870s in America was a time still shadowed by the Civil War's aftermath, when entire towns carried the grief of sons, fathers, and husbands who had marched away and never returned. Widowhood was a common state, and mourning was not just an individual expression, but a culture in itself. Black veils, jet jewelry, hair lockets, and endless funerals gave entire communities the appearance of living in half-shadow. In that environment, Clara Haraway's image as a perpetual mourner did not at first appear as strange as it would today. But as years passed, the singularity of her behavior, the way she performed grief without ever having known marriage, made her stand out as something other than bereaved. In Ashford Hollow, a rural settlement in the Midwest, society was narrow and insular. The town had one church, one schoolhouse, and a collection of wooden homes scattered along dirt roads. Strangers were noticed immediately, and gossip traveled faster than any horse-drawn carriage. In such a place, a woman's role was rigidly defined: marry, bear children, keep house, and uphold the dignity of her family. To remain unmarried past the age of 30 was to draw raised eyebrows. To remain unmarried while actively collecting wedding gowns was unthinkable. Yet Clara did exactly that, and in doing so she transformed herself into both a figure of curiosity and of dread. The times themselves fed her legend. The United States in 1871 was trying to stitch itself back together, but beneath the surface, suspicion and paranoia lingered. Secret societies, whispered curses, folk rituals, these lived alongside the railroads and factories that symbolized progress. People wanted explanations for the unexplainable, and when explanations failed, they turned to superstition. Clara's presence provided fertile ground for such imaginations. She wore black when others tried to return to color. She observed silences in an age when laughter was a deliberate rebellion against grief. She cultivated an air of death when the country was desperate for signs of rebirth. And then there was the number itself, 39. In a community obsessed with symbols, that number took on meanings that shifted with every telling. Some linked it to the Bible, pointing out that the law of Moses prescribed 40 lashes for punishment, yet tradition often stopped at 39 to avoid exceeding the limit. To them, the dresses marked Clara as a woman enacting her own kind of ritualized judgment, inflicting unseen punishments that ended in disappearance. Others whispered of old European superstitions that linked 39 to incomplete cycles, to marriages never consummated, to promises broken at the threshold of fulfillment. For many in Ashford Hollow, the number itself was proof that the collection was not innocent. It was deliberate, chosen, and meant to communicate something only Clara understood. The year also placed Clara in the grip of another cultural force, the Victorian obsession with death and memory. Across America and Europe, mourning had become not only a practice but a fashion, complete with rules, etiquette, and industries devoted to its expression. Mourning clothes were bought and worn for years. Postmortem photography was common, with families posing the dead alongside the living. Cemeteries became landscaped gardens where people picnicked among graves. In this climate, Clara's black veils and her fixation on wedding gowns became entangled in the larger, almost theatrical culture of death. To her neighbors, however, she went beyond the acceptable bounds of mourning. She had taken the rituals too far, preserving not the dead themselves but the symbols of beginnings. The dresses meant for life's happiest day, locked away as if in preparation for burial. The economic struggles of the period added another layer of suspicion. The Panic of 1873 was looming, but even before that, rural communities lived with scarcity. Few families could afford elaborate gowns, and when tragedy struck, possessions were often sold quickly to cover debts. That Clara managed to obtain and maintain 39 wedding dresses suggested resources no one fully understood. She had no husband to provide for her, no family fortune that anyone knew of. Where, then, had the money come from? Some suspected she profited from tragedy, buying dresses cheaply from desperate families. Others believed she extracted them from the suitors who courted her, gifts that never made it to the altar. The darker stories suggested the gowns were never given, but taken, claimed in the aftermath of disappearances no one wanted to investigate. It mattered, too, that the law in such towns was often weak, inconsistent, and reluctant to interfere in matters deemed private. Unless a crime left undeniable evidence, whispers rarely became investigations. Men disappeared all the time in those years, wandering west for work, falling to illness on the road, abandoning families to escape responsibility. For each vanished suitor, there was always a plausible explanation. It was easier and safer for townsfolk to mutter about curses and shadows than to accuse a neighbor outright. Clara thrived in that ambiguity. She could neither be proven guilty nor entirely exonerated, and so she remained in the liminal space between rumor and fact, between tragedy and horror. The very isolation of the town magnified the mystery. Ashford Hollow was miles from the nearest railway stop, surrounded by woods that seemed to swallow travelers. The roads were unlit, muddy, and prone to accidents. Disappearances could easily be blamed on nature or misfortune, and so they often were. Yet when those disappearances aligned with Clara's suitors, the pattern was too sharp to ignore. Her collection of dresses stood as silent witnesses, too many to be mere coincidence, too deliberate to be explained away by chance. The world outside Ashford Hollow was changing quickly. Telegraphs, railroads, factories, but within the town, time moved slower. Clara's legend grew year after year, shaped by repetition, embellished with every retelling. By the end of her life, she was no longer seen as a woman at all, but as a story, a warning, an omen. Travelers heard of her before they even arrived, and locals avoided her path as if proximity itself carried danger. The year marked her as a relic of a dying age, but the fear she inspired remained timeless. Her house stood like a monument to that fear, its candlelit windows glowing in a time when the rest of the world sought progress and brightness. Inside, the gowns were preserved against decay, untouched by the dust that crept into every other home. People said that was the strangest part. Nothing in Clara's house seemed to age. While the town weathered storms and droughts, while families buried loved ones and struggled through lean years, the dresses remained immaculate, as if protected by some invisible hand. In an age where decay was everywhere, permanence was unnatural, and so permanence became terrifying. By situating her legend in the year 1871, in the atmosphere of grief, superstition, and secrecy that marked post-war America, Clara's story could not be dismissed as mere eccentricity. It was an embodiment of the anxieties of her time, A woman without a husband was already an anomaly. A woman who turned marriage itself into a private theater of ghosts became something else entirely. The dresses, the rumors, the vanishings, all were fed by the culture of her era, an era where mourning defined life as much as joy, where superstition explained what reason would not, and where silence preserved secrets that might otherwise have been destroyed. In that silence, Clara thrived, and in that silence, her legend was born. Ashford Hollow was the kind of town where the streets emptied as soon as the sun dipped behind the trees, and where silence carried farther than sound. Nestled deep in the Midwest, it was little more than a cluster of houses, a church with a tall white steeple and a handful of shops that supplied the basic needs of farmers and their families. The land around it was thick with woods, threaded with marshes that gave off mist at dawn and dusk. To outsiders, it was picturesque in its simplicity. To those who lived there, it was both a sanctuary and a trap, a place where every face was known and every absence was noticed. It was in this closed world that Clara Haraway lived, and it was in this closed world that her legend was born. The people of Ashford Hollow lived by unwritten rules, and chief among them was conformity. A woman was expected to marry, to manage a household, to be part of the endless cycle of births, deaths, and Sunday sermons that defined the rhythm of life. To deviate was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny quickly became suspicion. Clara, with her black veils, her solitary home, and her strange obsession with wedding gowns, did more than deviate. She challenged the very structure that held the town together. She refused to play her part, and so the town cast her in another role, that of the widow, the one who embodied loss without ever having earned it. Ashford Hollow was not without its tragedies. Farmers fell to accidents with machinery or beasts. Children succumbed to fevers, and men vanished on the road in search of better work. Death was an expected visitor, and mourning was a visible, almost public act. Black dresses, veils, and somber expressions marked the bereaved for months, sometimes years. But mourning was supposed to follow marriage, supposed to follow the natural progression of union, birth, and then loss. Clara turned that order on its head. She mourned without the union, carried grief as her permanent attire, and cultivated a presence that made people feel as though they stood in the company of someone already claimed by death. Her farmhouse stood on the edge of town, set apart from the others, its shutters perpetually half-closed. A single path led to it, and that path was rarely traveled except by those with pressing business. Travelers sometimes knocked, believing it a place to rest, but locals warned them away. It was said that once you entered, you might not come out the same, or at all. Whether true or not, the warning was enough to give her home a reputation as haunted long before anyone whispered of the dresses inside. Children raced past its gates at night, daring each other to linger long enough to count the windows, and parents shook their heads, telling them not to tempt fate. Within such a tightly woven community, gossip was inevitable. The church was where most of it was exchanged, beneath the hymns and sermons, where women whispered behind gloved hands and men muttered in the aisles. Clara's name was mentioned often, not in anger but in unease. Some pitied her, believing her to be cursed, condemned to solitude no matter how many suitors she attracted. Others saw in her an active danger, a woman who lured men into her orbit only for them to vanish. A handful dismissed the stories altogether, chalking them up to superstition born of boredom. Yet, even those skeptics avoided her home. It was one thing to scoff at tales in daylight. It was another to test them when the mists rose from the marshes and the woods pressed close around the town. The religious culture of Ashford Hollow also shaped how Clara was perceived. The church was strict, preaching constantly of sin, salvation, and the dangers of straying from God's path. To the congregation, Clara's lifestyle was not just unusual, it was suspiciously unholy. Her fixation on dresses, symbols of a union, blessed by God, but never fulfilled in her own life, seemed to mock the sanctity of marriage. Her solitary walks through the graveyard were seen not as mourning, but as communion with the dead. When she lingered at the cemetery gates, townsfolk said she looked less like a woman remembering loved ones and more like a sentinel, standing guard over secrets buried deep. The environment of the town itself amplified the unease. Nights were long, and darkness fell fast. Without street lamps, the only light came from lanterns, and shadows seemed to stretch forever. The woods that ringed Ashford Hollow were dense, filled with sounds that unsettled the imagination. The cry of owls mistaken for screams, the rustling of animals mistaken for footsteps. In such a setting, the line between truth and fear blurred. Easily. A missing man could have been taken by bandits or by the wilderness itself, but when that man had last been seen in the company of Clara Haraway, the townsfolk preferred the darker story. It was easier to blame the widow than to admit the world was full of chaos and danger they could not control. The smallness of Ashford Hollow meant that stories repeated themselves until they became fact. A neighbor swearing she saw gowns through Clara's window became a tale told as though everyone had witnessed it. A traveler who never returned was transformed into another suitor claimed by the widow, whether he had ever spoken to her or not. Over time, the boundary between Clara, the woman, and Clara, the legend, dissolved. She became less a person in the eyes of her neighbors and more a living myth, a warning to those who might stray too close to her path. Yet beneath the fear was fascination. Ashford Hollow was a place of routine, where lives followed predictable patterns and excitement was rare. Clara was a disruption to that monotony, a figure whose mystery gave people something to speak about, something to fear and speculate on. In their secret hearts, many were drawn to the strangeness of her story, even as they condemned her aloud. She embodied the forbidden, the possibility that their world contained more than fields, sermons, and seasons. That duality, fear and fascination, kept her legend alive long after the last of her supposed suitors vanished. The region itself carried its own history of superstition. Folk tales from the old world still clung to families, carried across oceans and whispered by firelight. Stories of witches, curses, and restless spirits were part of the cultural inheritance, and Clara's life seemed to confirm those old fears. She fit neatly into the shape of a cautionary tale, a living reminder that not all who looked like women were entirely of the living. Ashford Hollow's isolation also meant that once her reputation was set, there was little chance of escape from it. In larger towns or cities, Clara might have been one among many, her eccentricities overlooked or absorbed into a more diverse community. But in Ashford Hollow, every oddity was magnified, every deviation branded into identity. There was no anonymity, no fresh start. Once she became the widow, she could never again be simply Clara. The name followed her in every whispered conversation, every sideways glance, every story told to wide-eyed children at bedtime. This was the environment in which her collection grew, an environment that shaped how it was perceived and ensured that it could never be seen as innocent. In another place, 39 dresses might have been dismissed as the hobby of a lonely woman. In Ashford Hollow, they were transformed into evidence of something unspeakable woven into the fabric of rumor and fear. The town's insularity, its reliance on superstition, and its unforgiving gaze all combined to turn Clara Haraway into a figure larger than life, both pitied and feared, both shunned and endlessly discussed. The region gave birth to her legend, and in return, her legend gave the region one of its darkest and most enduring mysteries. The collection was said to have been hidden away in a single upstairs room, a place Clara kept locked from curious visitors and wandering eyes. Few had entered, and those who claimed they had spoke in hushed tones, as if recalling a nightmare, rather than an ordinary sight. They said the air inside was heavy, carrying a scent of dust and something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood. The curtains were always drawn, leaving the room dim, and in that half-light, row upon row of mannequins stood like pale sentinels, each draped in white gowns that shimmered faintly in the gloom. The dresses themselves were not uniform. Some were simple, fashioned from coarse fabric and bearing little adornment. Others were elaborate, with lace collars, pearl buttons, and long flowing trains. A few looked pristine, untouched by time, while others were yellowed and frayed at the edges, as though they had endured decades of decay. Locals who whispered of the collection always insisted that each dress was different, distinct, as though each had belonged to a different woman, or, more disturbingly, had been chosen for a different bride who never reached the altar. The number itself became part of the unease. 39 gowns, never 38 or 40, as though frozen at that precise count. People speculated that it marked the number of suitors who had vanished, or the number of ceremonies that had been planned, but never completed. Some claimed Clara added to the collection whenever a man disappeared, that each gown marked another life claimed. Others whispered that the dresses had been there when she moved in, part of a darker inheritance she was destined to guard. The lack of certainty only deepened the dread. What disturbed people most was the lifelike quality of the display. The mannequins, it was said, stood in poses too human to be accidental. One leaned slightly, as though waiting at a door. Another had its arms bent, as if ready to embrace. The effect, in the dim light, was that of a room filled not with fabric and wood, but with silent women, frozen in the moment before something terrible happened. Travelers who claimed to have glimpsed the room spoke of waking in the night with the impression that the dresses had followed them, that they saw white shapes at the edge of their vision long after leaving Ashford Hollow. Theories about the origins of the gowns multiplied. Some said Clara sewed them herself, stitching into each one the grief and bitterness she carried, imbuing them with a kind of life. Others insisted the dresses were trophies, taken from women who had once been betrothed to the men who vanished, as if Clara had not only claimed their lovers, but their very futures. A darker theory suggested the dresses had not been made for women at all, but for the men who vanished, ceremonial garments for a wedding that never took place, rituals that bound them to her in ways no church would ever sanctify. The physical details of the gowns also lent themselves to speculation. Some were reported to bear stains that did not look like age, faint brown blotches at the hems or sleeves that suggested blood. Others had rents in the fabric, as if torn during struggle. A few were said to be stitched with black thread along the seams, a grotesque contrast to the purity of white. People said no two gowns were ever the same, and yet, when described, their features blurred into something uncanny. Lace that looked too delicate to survive, pearls that gleamed as if newly polished, fabric that seemed to breathe in the half-darkness. The townsfolk avoided speaking directly of the dresses when Clara was near, but the stories clung to them like shadows. Parents warned children never to wander close to her home, saying she would add their garments to her collection if they lingered. Lovers whispered of her as a curse, a presence that could unravel their future with a single glance. Even the pastor hinted from the pulpit that certain collections were ungodly, though he never named her directly. The secrecy only magnified the legend, transforming the room of dresses into a chamber of horrors that none could prove but all believed existed. On stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees and lightning illuminated the horizon, some swore they saw figures in white moving past the farmhouse windows. They insisted the dresses did not remain still, that they swayed or shifted as though the mannequins had taken steps in the dark. A few claimed to hear faint sounds when passing her home at night, the rustle of fabric, the click of a pearl button snapping into place, or even the faint echo of a bridal march played on no instrument known. These accounts, unverifiable as they were, became part of the town's lore, cementing the collection as something otherworldly. The number 39 began to take on symbolic weight. People tied it to biblical references, to the lashes of punishment Christ had endured, to numbers of curses whispered in old folklore. Some wondered if Clara herself was trapped, compelled to maintain the dresses until the 40th was added, after which something unthinkable would occur. Others believed the number was incomplete, that it was a countdown to an inevitable finale, and that once the last gown was placed, the entire town would suffer. The obsession with numerology and symbolism grew in proportion to the fear, giving the collection a significance far beyond fabric and thread. Visitors who learned of the legend often scoffed at first, dismissing it as the wild imagination of a small town too isolated for its own good. But those who stayed long enough began to notice the weight in the air, the way people crossed themselves when they passed Clara's road, the way conversations dropped at the mention of gowns. Even skeptics admitted that there was something unsettling about how the number was always the same, never changing with the years. If Clara truly sewed the gowns herself, why had she stopped? If they were trophies, why had the disappearances ceased? And if the collection had been there before her, why had she chosen to remain its keeper? The effect of the collection was psychological, as much as physical. It was a symbol of absence, of lives interrupted, of futures denied. The white of the gowns, meant to represent purity and beginnings, became instead a color of mourning. For the people of Ashford Hollow, it was not just a room of dresses. It was a mirror of their deepest fears, that love could vanish, that safety could be stripped away, that death could be dressed as celebration. Over time, the story of Clara's dresses spread beyond the boundaries of the town. Travelers carried it with them, spinning it into ghost stories told by firelight, each version darker than the last. Some said the dresses still stood in the farmhouse, preserved by whatever force had kept Clara herself ageless in rumor. Others claimed the dresses had been moved, scattered across the countryside, each carrying with it the weight of its origin, each infecting a new place with dread. The collection had become larger than Clara, larger than Ashford Hollow, a legend stitched into the fabric of fear itself. The whispers began almost as soon as Clara Haraway's name first became associated with the missing men. In towns like Ashford Hollow, gossip was not idle talk. It was a form of survival, a way to explain the inexplicable, a shield against the dark corners of life that polite society refused to confront. And Clara gave them more material than anyone else. She was seen less as a woman and more as an omen. Her beauty, sharp and enduring well past the age when most women in that era were expected to fade into matronhood, was regarded with suspicion. How could she remain untouched, they asked, when others her age bore the marks of work, childbirth, and grief? It seemed unnatural, and unnaturalness in that time was just another word for danger. The men who pursued her were not strangers. They were local farmers, merchants, young travelers passing through with the railroad, men who should have left behind trails, belongings, or letters to their families. Instead, their lives ended in ellipses, a sudden halt with no explanation. Some disappeared after courting Clara only once, others after promising her a future. Families of the vanished would often recall a common thread. The last person known to see them alive was the widow of Ashford Hollow. When pressed, Clara gave no answers. She never wept, never searched, never raised her voice in protest. Instead, she maintained her composure with an unsettling calm, as if the disappearances had not shocked her at all, but merely confirmed something she already understood. The rumor that Clara lured men only to curse them spread like a sickness. It began innocently enough, with muttered theories exchanged between neighbors in churchyards and market stalls. Soon it became bolder. People began whispering that she was not human at all, that she had struck a bargain with forces beyond comprehension. The dresses, they said, were not mere fabric but vessels, each one capturing the soul of a man who had promised her marriage. She was weaving lives into garments, stitching futures into seams, binding the living into silence. Children were warned to never accept sweets or kind words from her. Couples whispered that her gaze could unravel their love. Men, especially young ones, were told to avoid her at all costs, yet paradoxically some still sought her out. Perhaps it was her allure, perhaps it was the forbidden thrill of pursuing someone wrapped in rumor, or perhaps it was simply disbelief in the superstitions of a fearful town. Whatever the reason, they approached her doorstep. And time and again, they vanished. As the disappearances mounted, the folklore darkened. Some believed Clara had been betrayed in her youth by a man who abandoned her on her wedding day. They said the shock had shattered her mind and bound her spirit to vengeance, forcing her to relive the moment of loss endlessly. Others suggested she had been born under a cursed sign, destined to bring death to any man who dared love her. And the most chilling version claimed she was no widow at all, but a bride of death itself, married in spirit to something beneath the soil or beyond the veil, a union that demanded constant sacrifice. Stories circulated of late-night screams near her property, muffled cries quickly swallowed by the wind. A farmhand once swore he saw lantern light in her upstairs window and shadows moving as though a ceremony were underway. Yet the figures were too many, too distorted to belong to one woman alone. Another man, emboldened by drink, claimed he had glimpsed her in the woods at midnight, walking barefoot in her black veil, scattering flower petals across unmarked graves. He never repeated the tale in sober daylight, but others remembered his trembling when he spoke it. The more the town speculated, the more Clara's silence fed their fears. She never confirmed nor denied the stories. She allowed them to fester, to grow teeth and claws. Some whispered that her refusal to defend herself was the most damning evidence of all, that only the guilty could remain so composed. Others wondered if she drew strength from their fear, if the constant repetition of her legend kept her power alive. In the end, it hardly mattered. Whether true or false, the town believed it, and belief was enough to shape reality. The connection between her dresses and the missing men became central to the mythology. Each time a man disappeared, someone would claim to have seen a new gown in her upstairs window. The count, always whispered, never spoken in her presence, rose until it reached 39. Then, suddenly, it stopped. No more men vanished. No more gowns appeared. Some took this as proof that Clara had finally completed whatever grim ritual she had been enacting. Others suggested that fear itself had cut her off, that no man dared go near her once the legend became too heavy to ignore. But the silence that followed was not relief. It was worse. It was anticipation, a waiting game, as if the town believed her work was not finished, only paused. By the time Clara grew old, the town had shaped her into something larger than life. A figure of dread woven from half-truths and superstition. Yet the oddest part was this: though everyone spoke of her with fear, no one moved against her. No vigilante mobs came to her doorstep. No sheriff arrested her. No pastor condemned her by name. The fear was too great, and with fear came paralysis. People believed that confronting her directly would only bring her curse down upon them. So they left her alone, the widow in her locked house, surrounded by her mannequins and gowns, a silent queen of whispered horror. The legend outlived her. When Clara finally died in her parlor, seated in her chair with her hands folded neatly in her lap, the townsfolk hesitated before entering her home. They feared what they might find in that locked upstairs room. And when they did force the door, the sight confirmed every whisper they had ever spoken. 39 gowns stood waiting, like an audience of brides. And in that moment, the town realized the rumor had become something more than gossip. It had become history. The gowns themselves carried their own secrets, and investigators claimed to find personal tokens sewn into their linings, rings, locks of hair, fragments of letters. Evidence that each gown was tied not only to Clara, but to a life once lived, a life cut short. The truth of whether Clara killed those men, or whether their disappearances were coincidence, has never been resolved. But the whispers remain, that she was more than a woman, that she was a curse given form, that she was the widow who turned promises into shrouds, and perhaps, they say, she still waits for a 40th gown. When the house was finally entered after Clara Haraway's death, the whispers became flesh. The air inside was heavy, as though the walls themselves had absorbed decades of silence, grief, and dread. Dust clung to every surface except the gowns. Those gowns, eerily pristine despite the neglect surrounding them, were arranged in their solemn ranks, lit dimly by shafts of sunlight that forced their way through the cracks in boarded windows. At first glance, they seemed to be no more than relics of obsession, fabric collected and preserved by a lonely woman with too much time and too few connections to the world outside. But closer inspection revealed details that turned fascination into horror. Hidden in the folds of lace and satin were objects that should not have been there. Locks of hair bound by ribbon, fragments of letters written in fading ink, scraps of jewelry, even finger bones, yellowed with age and smoothed as if handled too often. The gowns were not garments of celebration. They were reliquaries, stitched tombs of memory and flesh. Each one appeared to hold fragments of a life interrupted, a missing fiancé's name embroidered in hidden thread along a hem. a broken pocket watch stitched into the lining of a bodice, a dried boutonniere sewn into the sleeve of another. Each discovery deepened the question. Were these the remnants of men who had vanished, or tokens stolen from families in mourning, gathered at funerals Clara had attended as the town's ever-watchful widow? The evidence was ambiguous enough to keep her between guilt and innocence, but dark enough to keep the legend alive. Investigators, such as they were in a town like Ashford Hollow, could find no bodies, no graves, no undeniable link between Clara and the vanished. Yet the collection itself seemed like testimony. Why else would a woman who never married keep 39 gowns? Why would they be tailored to varying sizes, as though meant for brides who never existed? And why would she stitch into them the personal remnants of men whose lives ended in silence? No explanation satisfied the townsfolk. Coincidence felt like a lie. Madness seemed too simple. The weight of the collection demanded a darker conclusion. The day the gowns were found, neighbors gathered in hushed groups outside her home, debating whether to destroy them or preserve them. Some argued they were cursed objects, vessels that bound restless spirits to the earth. They believed the gowns should be burned, their ashes scattered so the souls trapped within could finally be freed. Others feared destruction would release something far worse, that burning them would break the threads holding the darkness in place and allow it to seep into the living. In the end, no consensus was reached. The gowns were left in the house, for weeks, untouched, as if no one dared to make the final decision. Then the fire came. Officially it was called an accident, a tipped lantern perhaps, or faulty wiring in the kitchen. But many suspected the blaze was deliberate, set by townsfolk, too terrified to admit they had taken matters into their own hands. The flames consumed the house quickly, crackling through dry beams and collapsing floors until the entire structure was reduced to ash. Witnesses swore the gowns did not burn like ordinary cloth. They claimed the fire clung to them stubbornly, each dress glowing white in the inferno until they collapsed into embers with a sound like breaking glass. Some even insisted they saw shapes in the smoke, figures in veils walking away from the ruins, disappearing into the woods before the fire died down. What survived of Clara's collection became fragments of folklore. People spoke of charred pearls, found in the ashes, of melted gold fused to bits of scorched fabric, of a bone that refused to burn, discovered amid the wreckage and buried quickly without ceremony. These relics circulated in whispers for years, said to be cursed, said to bring misfortune to anyone who touched them. Farmers claimed livestock sickened when the wind carried smoke from the burned house across their fields. Children swore they could hear faint music in the ruins, like the echo of a bridal march played on unseen instruments. Historians who later studied the tale suggested alternative explanations. Perhaps Clara's collection had been nothing more than a fixation, born of loneliness and societal rejection. Perhaps she bought discarded dresses from estate sales or traveling merchants, weaving her own private world in defiance of the one that rejected her. The bones and jewelry, skeptics argued, may have been offerings from mourners who trusted her to hold their grief in trust, as widows were often called to do in small, faith-driven communities. The fire, they said, was likely the town's attempt to erase embarrassment, to bury evidence of how far gossip had gone unchecked. But even these rational voices admitted one thing. No matter how ordinary the truth may have been, the town had shaped Clara into something extraordinary, an emblem of fear and desire, obsession and absence. The legend traveled beyond Ashford Hollow. Travelers carried it across states, retelling the story of the widow who never married, the 39 gowns, and the men who never came home. In some versions, the gowns were trophies of murder. In others, they were vessels for unfulfilled vows. And in still darker renditions, Clara herself never died but simply vanished, leaving behind the gowns as husks, proof of her existence, but not of her end. Wherever the story was told, it changed to fit the fears of those who heard it. For some, it was a cautionary tale about women who defied their roles. For others, it was proof of supernatural forces lingering in plain sight. For all, it was unforgettable. Today, no physical trace of the gowns remains, at least not publicly. The fire consumed the house, the ashes scattered, the evidence erased. Yet rumors persist of hidden remnants, an unburned scrap of silk locked in a church vault, a gown smuggled away before the fire and passed down in secret. It seems still holding something not meant for living hands. Whether these relics exist or not, they are spoken of with reverence and fear, as though even fragments of Clara's obsession still carry weight enough to curse, and so the mystery of the 39 gowns endures. Were they symbols of mourning, remnants of madness, or tokens of murder? The truth lies buried with Clara, silenced by fire and shadow, but the questions remain, as sharp and enduring as ever. Why did she gather them? Who did they belong to? And what secret was sewn into the seam so carefully that even flames could not burn it away? If you've made it this far into the story, you already know that legends like Clara Haraway's are more than just ghost stories. They are shadows of history, whispers of lives, obsessions, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. But here's the unsettling part. We will never truly know how much of this was fact and how much was fear reshaped into folklore. Was Clara a murderer, a mad woman, or simply a victim of the town's darkest imagination? That's where you come in. I want to hear from you. Do you believe the 39 wedding gowns were evidence of something sinister? Were they trophies, relics of vanished men, or symbols of a mind consumed by grief? Or do you think Clara was nothing more than a misunderstood woman crushed beneath superstition and gossip? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone, and your perspective might change how others see this story. If you're fascinated by these kinds of hidden histories, where fact and fear intertwine, then make sure you subscribe right now. Every week we dive into more stories the world tried to silence. True crime that never made the textbooks, mysteries that linger in the dark corners of history, and legends too unsettling to forget. And by subscribing, you're not just following along. You're becoming part of a community that keeps these forgotten stories alive. So hit that subscribe button, drop a comment with your theory, and let's unravel the next forbidden chapter together.